The night is pitch black over the mountains of northern Corsica, and the man moving through the scrub has no rank, no name tape, no insignia of any kind. He's wearing a beat-up jacket meant to mark him as a prisoner of war. Somewhere behind him, armed patrols are working the ridgelines with orders to run him down. It's September 1962, and technically, this is just a training exercise, a joint drill between the British Special Air Service and French paratroopers, the legendary Beret Rouge. The man in the POW jacket is American Green Beret Captain Charles Beckwith, here as part of an SAS exchange program. Nobody warned him it would feel so real. The 33-year-old Korean War veteran moves fast, low, breathing hard, desperate to evade the French patrols closing in. As Beckwith and his SAS partner dart through the night from ridge to ridge, it all starts to make sense. When he first arrived earlier that summer, he found the SAS to be a disorganized rabble with messy living conditions and no sense of order at all. It wasn't like any army he'd known back home. But then he understood. With the SAS, discipline is not performative. Energy is not wasted on visual standards, empty ceremony, or ticking boxes. It goes into things that actually matter. The beret he's fighting to earn the right to wear isn't issued like a piece of kit. It's earned through a selection process built to break a man down first. And an exercise like tonight's doesn't get treated as make-believe. Dawn starts to gray the sky as Beckwith and his partner finally slip undetected past the last patrol line and reach the rendezvous point. He's wrung out with exhaustion, soaked through with sweat, and has a burning question on his mind. Why doesn't the US build units like this? Within months, the danger no longer had to be manufactured. The SAS sent Beckwith to the Thai-Malaya border, into humid jungle, crawling with leftover communist guerrilla fighters who were still holding out in the aftermath of the Malayan emergency of the previous decade. This wasn't America's mission, but Beckwith threw himself into it with as much fervor as his British comrades. His months of intense training allowing him to keep up in a way he wouldn't have been able to before. Malaya had shown him just how effective the SAS really were in real combat zones. Before his tour with the British was even finished, Beckwith started drafting reports on how they operated and developing his own idea, which he was convinced would transform the US military. He arrived back at Fort Bragg in mid-1963, ready to tell his superiors about his plan. But they'd soon find out that they weren't ready for him. It was a lukewarm reception at best. One of his new commanding officers, unimpressed by what a year in England had done to his appearance, told him to clean himself up. Beckwith answered with enough sarcasm that he was out of the unit within days. He sought out Colonel Clyde Russell, a man he respected, hoping for guidance, and got told flatly that the SAS exchange hadn't taught him anything worth building a career on. Beckwith refused to be dissuaded. He wrote up a formal after-action report, making the case for an American unit built on the SAS model, hand-picked, rigorously selected, trained for direct action, rather than the kind of unconventional warfare Special Forces had specialized in for years. He submitted it through the proper channels and waited for a response. It went nowhere. Still, Beckwith refused to give up, going over the heads of everyone above him by mailing a more detailed version straight to Georgia Senator Richard Russell, a level of political end-running that could have ended his career on its own. It did at least get a reaction. Word was passed down to General William Yarborough, one of the Army's most senior Special Forces advocates, who ordered a formal study into the idea. The study reached the same conclusion the Army had reached from the start. No. So Beckwith redirected the fight. If he couldn't build a new unit yet, he'd do his best to rebuild what he already had. He tore in with the training regime at 7th Special Forces Group, dragging his men through brutal exercises in the Pisgah National Forest, teaching radio operators to run encrypted traffic over frequencies nobody in the regular army bothered to use, treating every drill with the same intensity he'd learned to expect from the SAS. In 1965, Beckwith would get his first chance to lead a Special Forces unit in combat, and his arrival would transform it completely. Promoted to major, he volunteered for Vietnam and was handed a command nobody else seemed to want: Project Delta, a small reconnaissance unit built around American Green Berets working alongside their South Vietnamese counterparts, tasked with the kind of long-range missions regular infantry couldn't touch. What he found waiting for him wasn't what he'd pictured. His men weren't training. They were living it up in town, drinking, spending their nights however they pleased, treating the war like it was happening somewhere else. He called a formation and told them they were there to fight, not to enjoy themselves on the Army's dime. He did so in language nobody in that unit forgot. Out of roughly 30 men, all but a handful walked out on the spot rather than fall in line with what he was demanding. He didn't chase them down. Instead, he put up a flyer advertising for recruits. It read, quote, "Wanted. Volunteers for Project Delta. Will guarantee you a medal, a body bag, or both." It worked exactly as Beckwith had intended. The men looking for an easy tour were scared off. The ones who applied, which turned out to be more than Beckwith had expected, were soldiers who were absolutely serious about their work and in search of the kind of war that only a commanding officer like him could provide. Before long, Beckwith had built a unit worthy of the Special Forces name. Now it was time to take it into battle. Plei Me was a camp in the central highlands of South Vietnam, manned by a dozen American Green Berets, a handful of South Vietnamese Special Forces, and several hundred Montagnard irregulars. As night fell on October 19th, the base was hit by Communist forces. Sappers blew gaps in the wire. Rockets and recoilless rifle fire tore out the northwest blockhouse, the communications bunker, and the aid station. By 8 a.m. the next day, enemy shock troops had blown in the main gate itself with satchel charges, and only daylight airstrikes drove them back into the jungle. A Special Forces sergeant, trying to reach the crew of a downed helicopter, was fatally wounded before he could get back inside the wire. Word reached Beckwith that same day. He gathered 15 of his own Project Delta soldiers and 2 Vietnamese ranger companies attached to his command, and moved them toward the camp that night. The Americans already suspected that any relief effort might be walking into an ambush of its own. They just didn't yet know how big or how deliberate the trap really was. Before committing his men, Beckwith went up himself, flying with the 5th Special Forces Group commander to personally scout the landing zone. On the return flight, the escorting gunship threw a rotor blade and went down. None of its 4 crew members survived. The mission was already costing lives before Beckwith and his team had even made it onto the ground. When they eventually did, they took a deliberately roundabout route to avoid the likely ambush along the direct path. They landed several miles short of the camp and closed the rest of the distance on foot, struggling through thick jungle. They reached Plei Me on the morning of October 22nd. The situation was grim. The camp was getting hit from every direction, and the men inside were pinned down, reacting instead of fighting. Documents recovered from a dead enemy soldier confirmed what nobody in Saigon had wanted to believe. These weren't guerrillas anymore. For the first time in the war, regular North Vietnamese army units had committed to open battle against U.S. forces. That afternoon, Beckwith ordered both ranger companies out to clear the high ground the enemy fire was coming from. Captain Thomas Pusser, an advisor Beckwith thought highly of, chose to go out with the weaker of the 2 companies, specifically to help keep it moving. The North Vietnamese let both companies get clear of the gate before opening up with everything they had. 14 men didn't come back, Pusser among them. Meanwhile, a reporter named Joe Galloway had managed to talk his way onto a supply flight into Plei Me, hoping for a story. Galloway asked a sergeant how to find the man running the defense. The sergeant gave simple instructions to identify Beckwith. Quote, "When you see a real big man yelling, 'Press on,' that's him." Galloway soon found him But things would take an unexpected turn when Beckwith yelled at him, quote, "I need everything in the damned world. I need ammunition, I need medical supplies, I need food, I need water. I'd love a bottle of Jim Beam. And what has the Army in its wisdom sent me but a damned reporter? I have no vacancy here for a reporter, but I need a corner machine gunner, and you're it." Galloway would spend the next 3 days manning a gun instead of a notebook. By October 23rd, the outlook at Plei Me was growing increasingly bleak. Beckwith's men were taking the heaviest fire of the siege so far. Automatic weapons, mortars, wave after wave of it, with no sign of letting up. President Johnson sent Beckwith a message, quote, "We're thinking about you. Hold out there as long as you can. God bless you all." The camp was still resisting, but only just, and everyone inside knew it couldn't go on forever. There was one lifeline left, a column of South Vietnamese tanks and armored vehicles grinding up the highway toward Plei Me. Beckwith prayed the reinforcements would be enough to tip the balance in the defenders' favor. But as they approached the camp, they came in for a nasty shock. North Vietnamese ambush that Beckwith's team managed to avoid pounced on the tank column instead. Fierce fighting ensued. It was only after the arrival of heavy air support that the South Vietnamese unit was able to break free and reach Plei Me. It proved to be just the assistance Beckwith needed to save the camp. On October 25th, the siege finally broke. It was Beckwith's first real test in combat. For 3 years, his case for how American soldiers should fight had lived on paper, in reports that so far nobody had taken seriously. At Plei Me, for the first time, it lived under fire instead, and it held. Plei Me hadn't made Beckwith more careful. If anything, it confirmed he'd been right to lead from the front. Soon enough, Beckwith's aggressive all-or-nothing style had earned him a new nickname, Chargin Charlie. Early in 1966, Project Delta was ordered into the An Lao Valley as part of a larger operation to push North Vietnamese forces out of the area. Beckwith had reservations about the mission from the start and made sure his superiors knew it. He went anyway, sending his teams out to scout ahead of the main advance. When one of those teams ran into heavy resistance, Beckwith didn't wait behind for a report. He climbed into a helicopter to reach them himself, flying low over territory thick with the enemy. A .50 caliber round tore through the aircraft and caught him in the abdomen. He lost consciousness almost immediately. By the time he reached the hospital, the wound looked bad enough that the surgeons treating him didn't expect him to make it through. He spent the next month recovering, working through complications and repeated transfusions, all while learning what had happened to the men in the field he'd flown out to reach. It wasn't good news. But once he was cleared for duty again, Beckwith did what he always did. He went looking for the next fight. Rather than the desk job that would have made sense for a man freshly stitched back together, he'd begun to believe, somewhere underneath the surface, that he was somehow invincible. In 1968, he went back to Vietnam a third time, commanding an infantry battalion in the 101st Airborne, known as No Slack, through 9 brutal months of fighting. From there, it was a string of postings. Then, in 1975, he returned to Fort Bragg as commandant of the Special Warfare School, the very institution responsible for training the Army's Green Berets. From the outside, it looked like a fitting place for a man with his record to land. But in his own mind, nothing had changed. He was still fighting the same argument he'd been having with the Army since 1963. Why doesn't this country have a unit like the SAS? The world outside was finally starting to agree with him. Airline hijackings were becoming a fact of daily life. Terrorists had taken the lives of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. A daring Israeli raid on Entebbe had shown exactly what a small elite force could accomplish, and a government was willing to build one and trust it. For over a decade, Beckwith had been the man nobody in Washington wanted to hear. Now, for the first time, they were starting to wonder if he'd been right all along. One man who thought so was General Robert Kingston. In August 1976, he enlisted Beckwith and Colonel Tom Henry to draft a formal proposal for an American SAS-style unit. In November 1977, the Army finally gave its official approval for the creation of the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, more commonly known simply as Delta Force. Beckwith would be its founding commander. It was the moment he'd been waiting for 13 years. Now, he had to recruit his team. To ensure the absolute highest standards, Beckwith was adamant that the selection process would be formal and rigorous, built the way he'd first seen the SAS do it back in 1962, however long it took to get right. But there was something he hadn't accounted for. The same month Delta Force was approved, Colonel Robert Black Gloves Mountell, an old rival of Beckwith's from the 5th Special Forces Group, was authorized to create his own elite counterterrorism unit, known as Blue Light. And unlike Beckwith, he had no interest in a lengthy recruitment process. He simply called up Vietnam veterans he already knew and trusted, and put them in straight to work. Within weeks, while Beckwith was only just beginning to assemble Delta Force, Blue Light was already up and running. It was only intended as a stopgap until Beckwith's unit was ready, but it still hurt. After finally getting what he'd wanted, he'd have to watch someone else's rush version of his own idea take the field first. It didn't take long for Mountell's men to start showing off. Blue Light ran live fire demonstrations for the FBI director, the CIA director, and a parade of generals eager to see America's new counterterrorism capability in action. At one demonstration, snipers shot balloons filled with red dye just inches from the head of the Army's own Chief of Staff, General Bernard Rogers. Beckwith, meanwhile, was still looking for men interested in trying out for Delta Force. Early volunteer Peter Schoomaker, who would go on decades later to become the Army's top general, later explained that Beckwith was looking for, quote, a bunch of bad cats who wanted to do something different. However, he was struggling just to fill his own selection courses, as other commanders across the Army quietly refused to release their best men to try out for a unit that didn't even have a track record yet. He stuck to the plan anyway. Anyone who wanted into his unit had to pass the same brutal test he designed from what he'd endured in the Welsh Mountains 15 years earlier, an unmarked land navigation ordeal through rough backcountry, ending in a march of dozens of miles under a heavy rucksack with no announced time limit. Candidates who survived the physical gauntlet still had to sit before a board and admit honestly what they didn't do well. Anyone who claimed no weaknesses was out on the spot, no matter how good they looked in the trials. In July 1978, it paid off. Beckwith's unit passed its own validation exercise, clearing a hijacked aircraft and a hostage-held building under live evaluation. For Beckwith's rivals, it was the end. As he put it, quote, Blue Light seemed now, after our evaluation, to be redundant. Delta Force had filled the gap, and we could be put on alert. If anything went down, we were ready to handle it. A few weeks later, Blue Light was quietly disbanded. Delta Force's first major test would come in November 1979, when a mob of Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took more than 60 Americans hostage. Delta Force, validated and combat-ready for barely a month, was told to prepare for a rescue mission unlike anything it had trained for. It was called Operation Eagle Claw. Beckwith was named Ground Force Commander. This was his chance to prove, on the biggest stage imaginable, that his unit could do exactly what he'd always promised it could. Good intelligence on the ground in Tehran was thin. There was no long-standing informant inside the country feeding real-time updates, and planners had to piece together a picture of the embassy compound from old photographs and second-hand accounts. Beckwith's men filled the gaps the way they'd trained to, refining the plan constantly as new scraps of information came in. Rehearsing against a mock-up of the compound, adjusting again and again until they were satisfied it would hold up. The operation itself was genuinely audacious. Delta's operators would fly into the Iranian desert by transport plane, meet Navy helicopters launched from a carrier at sea, refuel at a remote staging point, then continue toward a hiding spot near Tehran to storm the embassy under cover of night. It demanded the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps to coordinate with total precision, using helicopter crews who had little experience with the exact kind of low-level, nighttime flying the mission required. But Beckwith remained optimistic. To guard against the operation's most obvious weak point, Beckwith and his planners built in one hard rule. If fewer than 6 of the 8 helicopters were operational once the force reached its refueling point in the Iranian desert, the mission would be aborted outright, no matter how far they'd already come. Getting the mission approved at all was its own battle. President Carter had spent months exhausting every diplomatic option, reluctant to risk American lives on a military gamble, and Beckwith had genuinely doubted he'd ever pull the trigger. On April 18th, at a White House meeting, Carter finally gave the order to go. Though Beckwith was optimistic about the plan, he was surprised the president approved it. He later said, quote, "I had no idea President Carter would make the decision that he did make. I almost fell out of my chair." Now, that decision had been made, and there was no turning back. On the night of April 24th, the helicopters lifted off toward Desert 1, a strip of Iranian desert where Delta Force waited to link up with them for the push toward Tehran. Things went wrong fast. One helicopter developed a cracked rotor blade and was abandoned. A second flew into a wall of wind-blown sand, lost its instruments, and turned back. The rest pushed through the same storm, arriving late and caked in dust. Then a third developed a hydraulic failure on the ground. That left just 5 aircraft flying. For 4.5 hours, commanders searched for a way to save the operation. Beckwith refused. He'd built his whole career on the belief that a standard means nothing if you bend it or it's inconvenient. He recommended aborting. In his own words, quote, "I was not about to be party to half-assed loading on a bunch of aircraft and going up and murdering a bunch of the finest soldiers in the world." The president agreed. However, as the force withdrew, one helicopter lifted off to reposition, lost its bearings and its own rotor wash, and drifted into a parked transport plane loaded with fuel and troops. The 2 aircraft collided and burst into flames. 8 American servicemen didn't make it out. Beckwith came home to a country that had watched his mission collapse on live television. It was supposed to have been his crowning glory, the vindication of everything he'd been fighting for nearly 2 decades. Instead, he called it the worst failure of his life, and meant it. He admitted to a reporter, quote, "I'm very confused. I don't know what I'm going to do with my life." Friends who saw him in the years after said that he never really got over Desert 1. When the Senate asked him what had gone wrong, Beckett didn't just accept the blame. He explained that missions like this needed a permanent, dedicated command, not 4 different services thrown together for the first time under fire. The Joint Special Operations Command was built directly out of his testimony, a permanent structure to run missions the way Delta was supposed to have run this one. The 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment was created so elite units would never again have to rely on pilots who hadn't trained for this exact kind of mission. Delta Force itself never stopped moving. It has fought from Grenada to Somalia, Panama to Iraq. To this day, it remains one of the most capable military units on Earth.